frosted swords, frost storms, frosted cones, and frosted tips, I guess. This is my Frost Mage build for Elden Ring, focusing on making those enemies nice and chilly. Let's go! For character creation, this is either a prisoner or an astrologer. If you're looking for the early game setups, you can check out my class guides, but we'll be focusing on the later stages of the game in this video. I'll also be showing areas past Linear of the Lake, so be mindful of some of those spoilers, but I'll be avoiding any of the major bosses, so you should be fine. So how you play this build and essentially how it works is it's using the Dark Moon Greatsword, Ash of War, the Moonlight Greatsword, as one of your main, more or less, attacker, as it adds frost effects to your weapon, and you can charge the heavy attacks that deal a ranged projectile wave that does very solid damage. You can charge this attack as well to deal even more damage. It also has a high chance of staggering enemies, so after a couple of waves you can stagger enemies and follow up with critical hits. I'm also combining this with frost spells like Andulia's Moonblade, the Glintstone Iceberg, and Zamor Ice Storm. I'm a big fan of builds that have a lot of flexibility, and this build really ticks all the boxes for me. You've got a really good melee option with the Dark Moon Greatsword that you can follow up and deal damage in the melee range, or you can stay in range distance and deal damage with these ice spells. And we're kind of focusing on specializing in the frost damage and trying to trigger the frostbite effect on enemies, because frostbite status, when triggered, will deal an immediate amount of damage to the enemy, and then the effect will linger, causing the enemy to take increased damage during its duration, so you can get extra damage off just by using this. And as you get further in the game, you almost have to be applying a status effect to be getting the most success out of most fights, because the enemies have so much health. It's much easier to chip away at that health if you can deal status effects to them, whether it be bleed or any of the other builds, but we're focusing on frostbite for this one. Some of the spells we're using here, as mentioned, is Andulia's Moonblade. This is probably the spell you would mostly use on horseback or on some of the larger bosses, because you can actually hit enemies with the blade itself and the frost wave as well, and you can deal heaps of damage with this attack. Like, I feel like this is going to get nerfed because it does tons of damage if you can trigger both the blade and the wave hitting the larger enemies in the game. It's dropped by the Glintstone Dragon Ajula in the Cathedral of the Manocellus. We're also using Glintstone Iceberg, which is mostly for the aesthetic purposes of this build. It's not the greatest spell ever. It doesn't have good range. It does deal decent damage, and it does a little bit more damage because we are wearing the Snow Witch Helm, which boosts our cold sorceries, but you'll probably be using the Great Glintstone Shard as kind of that spammable spell for those situations where you might need one, because it does deal less damage but has much better range, and since the recent patch, its FP cost isn't so high, so it's a better spell to actually use. And the Glintstone Iceberg comes from Solus in the Soluvis Rise. I'm probably saying that terribly wrong, so apologies, but it comes from there. You can buy that from him or get it later down the line, depending on where you go with his quest. The Great Blade Phalanx we are also using to deal a little bit of damage, but mostly for the stagger potential that it does have. If you combine this with the Moonlight Greatsword's heavy attack, you should be able to stagger most enemies with a couple of waves and one of these, and then you can follow up with critical hits. And this comes from Kaku's Everjail, which is dropped by the boss in that area. Zamor Ice Storm is probably a lesser used spell, but I actually really like it. I think it's pretty cool. It is an AoE spell that can be charged, which fits perfectly for this build because we are using a lot of charge attacks, and the Godfrey's icon buffs our charged damage. So this works well, plus the frostbite damage increase that we're getting. So this works perfectly in this build again. But essentially what you do with this is it is great to clear out enemies, and you can charge this up to make it last a little bit longer and the AoE effect a little bit wider. And I use this at the start of fights to trigger the frostbite effect on enemies very quickly, because they do take chip damage from the damage over time effects, and it will quickly apply frostbite for enemies that are stuck in its range. This comes from the Zamor Ruins in the Mountaintops of Giants, so it might take you a little bit to get this. This is probably a much later spell that you will get, but once you've got it, you can absolutely use it. Loretta's Great Bow is also great for the really long range times when you might need to deal damage. You can get that in the Carrion Manor. And the Renala's Full Moon is also a cold spell. It's one of the only other cold spells that we haven't talked about yet, and I tinkered with using this, but it is so slow to charge and to actually use that it doesn't really have that much of a purpose, because you've got to turn yourself into a moon and then wait for the attack to go off. It's much better to use some of the other options here, and even just using the ranged option on the Dark Moon Greatsword is fantastic. So you don't really need it, but you could use it if you do want to. For your flasks here, I'm going roughly half and half between health and FP, but as you start getting further into the game, you probably want to stack more into health, because we will spend a bit of time at melee range. We're not using a shield, so you will want to have a decent amount of health there. And now physique flask, you should be buffing your magic damage and your charge attacks with your physique flask. So because we are charging up our Ash of War, and then we're also using magic damage a lot, it's good to use that as the entrance to most boss fights. For your attributes, the main attribute is intelligence, because this is what your sorceries are going to scale with, as well as the Dark Moon Greatsword. So you want to maximize this, probably getting to around the 60 range as soon as possible. You will need 16 need strength in order to be able to wield this sword as well. And then the rest of your points can really be evenly split between vigor, mind, and endurance, with probably a slightly higher priority into vigor because we will be spending that time in the melee range, and the more health you have, the more survivability you have, but evenly roughly between those 3 stats for any of your remaining points. The Frost Mage gear that we're really using here is the Snow Witch helm to boost our cold sorceries, or you could use something like the Hammer and Glintstone crown, which gives you a little bit of strength and endurance at the cost of some of your FP, but otherwise just wear whatever armor has the best physical and resistances that you can find throughout the game. The Snow Witch helm comes from Renna's questline at the end of that, and so does the Dark Moon Greatsword. I'm not going to go into details on how to get them specifically. You can Google it if you like. It's a pretty long questline and it's filled with spoilers, so I'm not going to mention that here, but they're both great and you should absolutely go and get them and Google how to do it. The Carrion Regal Scepter is the staff that I'm using. This comes from Renala's Remembrance, and this requires 60 intelligence, which is why we're hitting that 60 intelligence mark. This is a great staff that has really good sorcerer scaling. It has S scaling and it does scale perfectly, and until you get this staff, you could just use the Meteorite staff or any other staffs that are of value to you, but this is what I've gone in the staff route. For your talismans, I'm using the Godfrey icon to increase damage of my charged attacks, and this comes from Godfrey the Grafted in the Golden Lineage Everjail. The Radagon icon to lower my spell casting time, because we're spending a little bit of time in melee range. You want to get those spells off as quick as possible so you can go back to attacking or dodging, whereas in a ranged only build it's not too important, but because we're spending a lot of time in melee range, you want to be able to cast and then dodge and get out of the way, and this comes from Rhea Lucario Academy. The Carrion Filigree Crest is also great for this build, which reduces the cost of your Ash of Wars by 25%. This comes from the War Counselor Iggy, which is also, funnily enough, kind of connected to Renna's questline. Or you could use the Green Turtle Talisman to increase your stamina recovery speed, which is also important because this build can be pretty stamina hungry, so it will help you out in that case, and you can get that pretty early in the game. I've talked about it in other videos. And some general tips for playing this build is initially you want to make sure you're setting up before any of those big boss fights or big encounters that you foresee. Make sure you're casting the Moonlight Greatsword first, even just before you enter the boss arena, because it will last about 60 seconds or so you can cast it before you even get in there. Something like Great Blade Phalanx can be casted before you get in there as well, and using up your physique flask so you can get most of your buffs off quickly before you even have to worry about actually getting into the fight and dealing damage in there. Realistically, in those encounters, you want to deal as much damage as possible and be relatively aggressive, because you don't want to have to be casting the Ash of War again in the boss fight, because it is a slow cast, but you can get it off. You just need to be mindful that, you know, wait for that perfect time to actually cast it. Don't just try and dodge away and then quickly cast it, because you will get hit, and it happened to me many times while making this build and trying to work out how it's all going to work. Check out my Elden Ring best weapons video, which goes through some great weapons to try in Elden Ring if you're making your own builds. We are back making more videos again. I took a week off and now we are here making more videos.
You're back!
Yeah, this is my front. Thanks for setting me up with another classic quote.
Let me know in the comments anything specific you would like to see for Elden Ring or some other things. I'm working on some other unique things, so I'm interested to see what you guys think about that. But thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.